Let's talk about strategy, the purpose of the church. You know, we talk about objective strategy and tactical. And then later on this afternoon, we're going to talk about the 7 qualities of an oikos-centric church and what that looks like in terms of structure. Pastors usually don't start asking the right questions until we're desperate. Maybe that's why you're here. I don't know how you're feeling or how desperate you're feeling. But our friend Rick Warren has given us some great ideas regarding lifespan of pastoral leadership, lifespan of a church's ministry. And it looks a lot like a bell curve. In other words, somebody comes to a church to lead the church. And usually, when a new pastor begins a ministry in a church, the church is struggling. And I was having a very honest conversation with, this is growth, and this would be time. And I was talking to a gentleman who was really excited because it was a small church, and he was going to be called to lead this great, dynamic, small church. And I said, well, it's probably not as great and dynamic as you think. And I'm trying to burst your bubble. But he said, well, why do you say that? And I said, because they just got rid of a guy and are calling you. That's why. I mean, when pastors come into pastoral leadership, they're coming at a bad time. And if it was a good time, where would the former pastor be? He'd still be there, okay? Just some of the basic rules of how people feel about church life. Now, what happens? What happened to you? I could go around the room. You talk to Rick, talk to John, talk to David, talk to Sam, talk to Scott, talk to Tom. Those of us who are lead pastors in a ministry, what happens at the very beginning of our tenure is that there's an immediate burst of enthusiasm. It's called the honeymoon period. And the growth kind of, starts to streak forward. Some of the guys that were disillusioned with the former pastor, they start to come back. You've got this new vibe and this new excitement, this new energy, and people are reaching out to their oikos more than at any other time in a traditional paradigm, at any other time in this life cycle of a church than right there. And so there's great growth. And over time, what happens to the great growth? It begins to plateau. And if you wait too long to start asking the right questions, what happens is it starts to decline. When do we begin to ask questions that matter? Usually right about here, because we're desperate. In fact, sitting with Rick Warren a couple of years ago, he was explaining to a group of us that the job of the leader is to create new life curves for a church. So when it starts to get here, instead of waiting for it just to die, for everybody to become disillusioned, for them to fire you and get a new leader, is to create a new curve. And it's more like a roller coaster. Why does Saddleback keep kicking out 40 days of everything? Because they're creating new life curves for themselves. I mean, it's a brilliant strategy. I love it. But back to my point. Pastors don't ask the right questions here. Megachurch pastors very seldom ask the right questions ever. And the reason that they don't ask the right questions is because they don't have to. Because they're never here. See, we start, I'm not talking about normal pastors like us. I'm talking about the extremely gifted guys where all they have to do is sneeze and thousands of people come to Christ. And so they start their ministry, and there's this burst of growth, and this burst of enthusiasm. And if we're looking at time, how long is this for a megachurch pastor? From here to here? 10, 15, 20 years? Just because of their gift level. For most of us, what's the time? For a megachurch guy, this might be decades. For us, it's usually about a week and a half. And we start to struggle a little bit. But once again, megachurch pastors very seldom ask the right question. I'm not being critical, because they don't have to. By the time they get to here, it's been 30 years and they're off doing conference work, they're off doing They're university leadership, they're writing books, they're doing seminars, they're doing things for the benefit of the church at large, and it's all good. And again, I'm not here to criticize the way these guys lead. All I'm saying is that here is where we find ourselves all too often, right? We got to ask the right questions. What can create something new so we don't get here and they have to replace us? And again, I hope you don't get the impression that I think it's all about me and I got to preserve my job or my identity or my self-esteem. I want to learn what the Lord wants me to learn and do what he wants me to do. And if there's something we can do for the church that we lead, it's incumbent on us to do it. People will not attend church until we give them a good enough reason to. Because people will generally do anything if they have a good enough reason. I mean, you guys, we live in the United States of America in 2014. You give people a good reason, they will do anything. I mean, we live in the world of reality television. These are not sitcoms. These are not scripted. Most of them probably are, but it's just people will do anything. Now, here we go. People need a better reason to attend church than to simply hear you preach or to listen to your worship team play music. Now, this is why. Because there's probably a better preacher in driving distance to your campus, a better preacher than you are. Again, it is what it is. I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. I'm not trying to make you depressed. I'm just trying to say the truth. And we have conditioned the Christians in our country to go where the best preachers are. They will drive great distances right past the church you lead. In order to go hear the gifted guys. You say, well, that's not right, but that's what you do. You go to a conference, you look at the roster of speakers. And even the big conferences, there's some guys you've heard before. They're anointed at some level. They're doing great things, but they're just not very engaging. And so you bypass those seminars to go hear, the top 5. The poster boy for current relevance when it comes to church leadership. So you do the same thing. So let's not be too critical. I have 2 options at a conference. Speaker A's, very entertaining, very gifted, very dynamic. Speaker B's not. Where do you want to go, honey? Well, we're always going to want to migrate toward those arenas that are better. I tell guys, especially church boards, we've got quite a number of deacons here from Palm, so thanks you guys for coming, because what Dave tries to accomplish is best, when you're all reading off the same page, it's best accomplished. So props to you. And even the team from Grace, having all of you here, I think is helpful and will create a lot of conversations. But do you want Grace Church or Palms Church or Windsor Church or First Hemet or First Baptist San Diego? Who'd I miss? Got you all? Or High Desert Church? Do we want these churches to grow quickly? Okay, this is the only way to do it. Fire your pastor and hire a better preacher. It's the only way to do it. Okay? Everybody put your heads down. Who wants to do that? And there's always some attractiveness to that option. But this is the point. What would happen if all of a sudden and John's a very gifted teacher, so I feel free to kind of lean on him a little bit right now. We fire John, and all of a sudden we hire a guy who's twice as gifted as John on the weekend. And in Glendora, what takes place? Well, okay, we were going to a church that had a pastor a little more gifted than John, but now Grace has kind of leapfrogged our guy. So now we get a few people from all these other churches in the area who have been conditioned to believe that it's all about them anyway. It's a connection between just sitting in the pew and being well-fed and having their needs met. We got to go where the best guy is. So now all of a sudden, Grace gets this influx of 100 people from this church and 100 people from that church and 100 people from the third church. And, it doesn't take but a couple of months and the church has doubled in size. And it's like, wow, Grace is doing a good job. Grace has done nothing to benefit the kingdom. No, let me break the word nothing down for you. No thing. There's no net benefit. You say, well, High Desert Church has grown significantly. I've been here 30 years. It's not that significant, actually. People just need a better reason to attend church than to hear you preach or listen to your worship team play music. There's a better band. I love you guys. I love my guys. I love all our guys. There are better bands to go here. There are better worship leaders to go here. There are better preachers to go here. And what will the people in this culture do? They'll go there, if that's what it's about. And unfortunately, it has been about that for far too long. People need a better reason to attend church than simply because it's the right thing to do. I started going to church as a kid. Why did some of you who have been around the block a few times with me, why did we go to church when we were young? Why did our parents build into us, embed in our psyche this relationship between us and the local church? Because it's the right thing to do. Why do we go to church, Mom? Because God wants us to. Okay. Roger that. We live in a postmodern world now. You know what it means? The rules have changed. There is no right thing to do. We live in a pluralistic world of right things. People need a better reason to attend church than to simply keep it going. I talk to so many pastors who say, well, why do you want young people to come to your church? Well, I just don't want it to die on my watch. Like you're going to get to heaven and you're going to stand before Jesus at the Bema seat and he's going to say, way to go, dude. The church died on your watch. That's why they say we want young people to come to our church. How can we get young people to come to our church? I say, you can't. They say, well, why can't we? I say, because I know you. They're not going to want to come to hear you preach. They're not going to want to come because it's the right thing to do to come hear you preach. That's just not a good reason to have church, to see if we can help it survive. We can be seduced so easily into believing that a building or maintaining a local church is the objective. You guys, it's not the objective. It's strategic. I just love the story of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee with the fellas. And, they're fishermen, and they're really good fishermen. And if you've been to the Sea of Galilee, that place is just like gorgeous. And there's some very good fish being pulled out of that lake. And Jesus loved fish. Fellas, you can just fish for the rest of your natural lives. There's nothing wrong with that. Or you can follow me. And together we will change the world. And what's the next line? They dropped their nets. And they followed Jesus. Why? Because he gave them a good reason to. The church does not exist so we can just play music we feel comfortable with and have lunch with our friends after the service is over. What is the purpose for your church? I was asking a friend. He became a friend because we did an Oikos conference in Seoul, Korea together. And he's pastor of a multi-site church. He got more sites than we will ever even dream of having up in the Pacific Northwest. And so again, the conversations I have, it's just stimulating, provocative. I want to learn. And I said to him, so brother, what's the purpose of your church? And he gave me the purpose statement of the church he leads. And it was something like, upward, inward, outward, worship, growth, and evangelism. And I said, at HCC, that would never work. He said, he was a little bit offended. He said, well, why won't that work? And I said, because you give people options. You can't give people options. What do you think? You're going to give them an inward, upward, outward series of options. If I gave people at HCC those options, what would they always default to? Inward. Because that's the way our culture is. It's all about us. It's all about being fed. It's all about having my needs met. It's all about having the right place for me and my family. To what? And then after they get done taking care of themselves, you'll be lucky to get them to worship a little bit. But you will never, ever get them outward. I don't care if it's in your statement. There is no option. At HCC, what does the church exist for? What's the objective? Outward. That's the purpose of the church. For 2,000 years, the church has existed for only one reason. One. And again, far be it from me to posture myself as the mentor for Rick Warren. I mean, yeah, like that guy needs any help in having a dynamic ministry. That's not the point, but we've all read The Purpose-Driven Life and the 5 purposes for the church. Now, I know what Rick would say if he were here and we said, of the 5, what's the most important? And he would say outward. And that the other 4 prop up that utmost calling of the church to change the world. So it's semantics in many respects.
Tom,
yes?
Can this thing be moved so we can see the board?
You sure it's not my head?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, I will. I apologize. We sure can. And Rick has the 5 purposes of the church. Ours is one. It's to change the world. It's the only one that ultimately matters. See, there's a lot of ideas floating around the church as to what the purpose is. Number one, that I used to get all the time was to prevent Christians from becoming worldly. Really? That's the purpose of the church? Dallas Willard called it the gospel of sin management. Just got to manage your sin. I remember growing up in a youth group, and I went to a great church. Some of the most famous Bible teachers in Southern California would come through that church. We got like 4 or 5 staff members that all grew up in that church. I got nothing, and we didn't all come here together. We just kind of filtered in over time. I got nothing bad to say about the church. And so this could totally be on me. But I sat in my youth group truly believing that the purpose for my going to youth group was to make sure I screwed up less next week than I did last week. And that was the reason for church. Just stop making such stupid mistakes. Don't be an embarrassment to God. Don't be an embarrassment to your parents. Now, I'm not even saying that was the intended message. They might stand up here and say, well, that's not what we wanted to tell you. But that's what I heard. By the way, communication doesn't happen until what you say is what they hear. Manage our sin, we'll all be fine. And one of the functions of the church is to help manage sin. And you'll see that even at HTC. But it's not the purpose of the church. Can't be the purpose of the church. By the way, sin management was not a compelling reason to go. I went to church because it was the right thing to do. That's what I was taught. But then again, I wasn't growing up in 2014. I lived in a modern world where logic took hold. But sin management wasn't a compelling reason to go then, and it certainly isn't today. Which is great, because sin management isn't the reason you go to church. I'll prove it to you. When are you going to be more holy than any other time in your life? Not tomorrow. Not by coming to the seminar. About a second after you croak. You're going to be so dang holy as soon as you go to heaven, as soon as you die and go to heaven. Why? Because you'll be perfected. Sin management, the purpose of the church? Then why have a church? Might as well die right now. I want to be holy. Actually, that really is reflected on many suicide notes, because somehow they got the wrong message, oftentimes from people like us. Sin management is important, but it's a means to a much more important end. There's a purpose for it. How about worship God corporately? Some of you might argue that coming together to worship God is the primary purpose of the local church. I would expect that. In any group this size, there would be those that think it's all about worship. And we'll talk about worship the essence of worship in a few minutes, but there are a lot of very fast-growing churches that have taken that on as their purpose for coming together. They've just got incredible worship budgets. And they've got it's the show. And when I say the show, that almost sounds condescending. I don't mean it that way. By the way, I love going to those places because I need a lift at times. And they just, I'm there. I'm cool. It's great. They propel me forward in my faith. They actually help me to become more brave. There's great purpose in corporate worship. It's just not the purpose of the church. And I'll prove it to you. When will we worship better than in any other time in our lives? About a second after we croak. That's probably the best worship we'll ever see. When we gather around the throne of God and everybody's like worshiping perfectly. We can't even worship right. And it isn't what you're doing on stage, you guys. We come into the room and we come in, for this corporate worship experience, and what are we thinking about? The Bronco game's at 1:30. I got to sneak lunch in between the game and church, and my goodness, is that so-and-so? I can't believe that he's wearing that. And it's all these distractions in worship. And it isn't just that the music's going to be great. Our hearts are going to be so pure and so focused and so connected with God there more than we ever will be connected here. Some people say it's fellowship. Fellowship with and encourage other believers. That's the purpose of the church. And I know that's the purpose of some churches I've been in, because the big announcement every week is when the next potluck dinner is going to happen. But fellowship is not the purpose of the church. And how do I know that? Because of the next question I'm going to ask. Where's the greatest fellowship in the universe? In heaven. You'll have better fellowship a second after you croak than you ever will. You could attend the best church like on earth, the best local church on earth. It's not going to be anything like that. How about to learn more about the Bible? We got to learn the counsel of God. That's the purpose of the church. And again, I grew up under some great teaching ministries. I consider myself a fairly capable teacher now. I teach the Bible as if it were authoritative. I'm convinced it's absolutely critical for us to understand life and understand what God wants us to do in life. But learning about God is not the purpose of life. And it can't be. I'll prove it to you. When will you know more about God than any other time in your life? About a second after you croak. And you stand there. I think we're all going to have just this corporate sigh when we see God and go, oh. And we want to magnify God and glorify God, and we want to know God. I'm not saying we shouldn't study the Bible. I'm just saying, is that really the purpose of the church? Because if those things are the purpose of the church, then the church ought to cease to exist and go to heaven right now. So we can what? Better fulfill our purpose. Problem is, as important as those things are, we will instantly be better at all four of them than we can ever hope to be in this life. But God has kept us here to do something that we can't do after we croak. I'm just a simple thinking guy. There's got to be a reason why on April 7th, 1962, when I gave my heart to Christ at the age of 7, and now I'm sitting with you on January, what is this, the 13th? Is that the date? January 13, 2014, 52 years later. What was the purpose of this? If I'm going to be so holy and so God literate and such a perfect worshiper and fellowshipper in eternity, what have the last 52 pickin' years been about? Well, as Rick tells us in Purpose-Driven Life, there's only two things we can't do there better than here. One is sin. There will be no sin in heaven. If you want to sin, you go, son, you go, girl. If that's your goal, you better do it here. Not going to do it there. Or save the lost. because there won't be any lost people to save in heaven. See, I told you a minute ago, as a young man, I believed that what I did was for the sake of the church, the local church. I lived my life to make our church the best church in town. And now I believe the local church's primary goal is to help those who attend be successful, because God has called us to success as world changers. Now, I was explaining in a phone conversation a few years ago, and this is a real amazing story. And I shared a little bit about it in the book, but I'm talking to a guy in Illinois and his team. It was like 5 or 6 guys on a conference call. They called me up. He's a friend of Charles Arnn. Now, at that point, I had not met Charles Arnn. Now Charles has become a great friend. Charles is Win Arnn's son. Charles has actually taught some Oikos stuff with me, and we were in Korea together, and we become good friends. But then this guy is talking to Charles. I had not met either one. And he said, I'm going to do my doctoral dissertation on this Oikos idea. And Charles said, I just got a book, and I've heard about this church in Victorville, and you should talk to their pastor, because they not only believe in the Oikos principle, they've designed an entire ministry around the principle. So he calls me up, because I asked him, why are you calling me? And that was the story. So he's got like 4 or 5 associates on the phone. I'm talking on the phone in my office right up here in Victorville. And he's asking me about whether or not I'd be interested in coming to their church in Illinois, in Normal, Illinois. I was talking to Rick earlier about his experience in Illinois, and lead a weekend seminar. And so I said, so what? Tell me how you've gotten to the point you are right now, so I can tell you if even I'm the guy to help you take the next step. He said he had asked his team about inviting Tom to come, but then he said, one of the guys had a great idea. He said, before we bring this cat out here and start, elevating his ideas before our church family, let's just take the basic idea of Oikos and apply it in our lives, just the 5 or 6 of them, and begin filling out a card, which you'll be able to do later this afternoon if you haven't done it before, and begin praying for the people in our Oikos. And if it works, then we'll bring Tom out. So I said, so what happened? He said, Tom, that was 6 months ago. We started praying just for our Oikos cards, just the 5 or 6 of us. Just in our little Oikos worlds, 11 people have prayed to receive Christ and are now attending, have been baptized, now attending our church, just because the staff team decided to take the principle literally. And so now what we want you to do, Tom, is come and launch this thing. And I said, okay. And it worked out. It doesn't always work out, but it worked out. So then one of the guys said, by the way, Tom, and I've never met any of these guys, but it's a different voice, so I'm assuming it's not the senior pastor. Another voice comes on the line. By the way, Tom, what do you do for the mature people at High Desert Church? And I said, we don't have any. And they said, nothing. It felt like a half hour. It was probably more like 30 seconds of dead silence. Then a third voice pops up. You don't have any mature people at High Desert Church? Talking about spiritually mature people. I said, no. Dead silence. Then finally the senior gets back on the line. He's trying to throw me a lifeline, to save, me from the sharks that are beginning to circle in his conference room. And he said, Tom, you got thousands of people at your church, and you can't think of any of them that are spiritually mature? I said, well, I know what you're saying, guys, and let me just tell you the way we see it here. If you've been a Christian for like 10 minutes, you've got a lot of maturing to do. And if you've been a Christian for like 10 years, you've got a lot of maturing to do. And if you're like the pastor of that church, you've got a lot of maturing to do. And if you're like an apostle who planted churches all over the ancient world and wrote most of the books in the New Testament, you have not yet laid hold of it, but you've got a long way to go as you continue to mature in your faith. That's why we don't talk about having immature Christians and mature Christians. We've got thousands of maturing Christians. You see, this is the problem with most church ministries as I see it. Again, most that I have been exposed to at some level. You're preaching a sermon, and a guy comes up, his name is Joe, at the end of the sermon, and says, Pastor, just want to let you know I gave my heart to Christ today. You say, well, that's great. What's your name? Joe? Congratulations, Joe. He says, well, what do I do now? I said, well, now it's important, or you or I, whoever the pastor is, now it's important that you become a mature Christian. Now that you're born again, now you must become a mature Christian. Well, how do I do that? Well, what you do is you come to the discipleship class. He said, well, never heard of such a class. What does that mean? Well, we meet once every week for 6 months, and we learn about what it means to be a mature believer. Joe signs up for the class, comes back 6 months later, comes right down the aisle after the service. You haven't personally seen the guy for 6 months. He says, Pastor, I attended the discipleship class. Oh, Joe, I remember you. Yeah, that's great. How'd it go? Oh, it was great. Am I a mature Christian now? And you say, well, not yet. What do you mean not yet? I went to the discipleship class. Well, now you need to go to the advanced discipleship training. Oh, what does that mean? Well, now you get to go twice a week for a year. I say, Joe, man, that's a lot. But Joe says, I'll go. I want to be a mature Christian. So he attends the advanced discipleship class for a year. So now what are we into this thing? 18 months? 18 months later, Joe comes down the aisle. Hey, Joe, now you're becoming familiar with your conversation with Joe. And Joe says, I finished the advanced discipleship training. Am I mature now? Well, Joe, congratulations, but not quite yet. Well, why not? Well, now you have to go to the super advanced discipleship training class. Well, what does that look like? Well, now we meet 3 times a week for another year. Oh, man, that's a lot, but I want to be a mature Christian, so I'm going to go to the super advanced discipleship training. So he comes back a year later. So now what are we into this thing, 2.5 years? He says, Pastor, am I mature yet? Congratulations, Joe. Now you're a mature Christian. Well, what do I do now? Well, now go back to your friends and family and tell them about Jesus. Say, Pastor, I'd love to, but they've moved on. See, what the pastor has done without even intending to is actually plucked Joe out of the most fertile farmland for kingdom harvest ever. Actually, removed him, separated him from his potential for being successful in life as a Christian, and given him a brand new oikos. Only this time, the whole oikos is made up of who? Christians. In fact, sometimes when I say, let's talk about filling out your oikos card, I hear people say, well, Pastor, we don't have any non-believers in our oikos. Oh, man, that's a death wish, bro. You better go dig up some pagans, because you need a purpose for being alive, right? Now, let's just say that you or I, whoever that pastor is in that particular scenario, let's just say that it's not us. Let's say that the pastor of the church is Jesus Christ. So he preaches a sermon. Joe comes forward and says, hey, Pastor, today I gave my heart to you, actually. And Jesus says, congratulations, Joe, your life's never going to be the same. And he says, so, Pastor Jesus, what do I do now? And what does Jesus tell him? Go home to your own people and tell them what I've done for you and how I've shown mercy on you. And so Joe, he's an idiot. He doesn't even know what he did. He just leaves church and he goes back to his homies and he says, hey, you guys, things are going to be a little different around here. I just got to tell you, I went to church. They all start teasing him. And he says, and I'm now a born-again Christian. And they say, well, what does that mean? And Joe says, I have no idea. But I'm going to a discipleship class this week. And that's the first thing I'm going to ask the teacher. And so Joe goes to the discipleship class and he says, hey, by the way, what does it actually mean to be born again? Well, it means you've given your heart to Christ. And now you have spiritual life in Jesus. Oh, okay. He goes back, hey, fellas, I learned something in discipleship class the other day. You know, what's that? I learned what it means to be born again. They said, well, what does it mean to be born again? Well, now I have new life in Jesus, the Spirit of God living inside of me. They say, well, what does that mean? Joe says, what? I have no idea. But I'm going to ask that first time back at my discipleship class. What does it mean to have new life in Jesus? And the process goes on and on and on. Tom, are you against discipleship? Dude, I am not against discipleship at all. Have your classes. I don't even care. Knock yourself out. But you got to keep them focused on the biggest number in the church. It's called 95. You got to keep pushing them back to the place where they have the opportunity to do something right for the kingdom, to fulfill the objective of the church. The traditional paradigm, not so much that it's a bad one, it's just that the question always, always, always must be, what's the end game? What's the end game? The eternal salvation of the lost, right? That's the objective. You know, what did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37? And I love this passage perhaps as much as anything, because I want you to know that Oikos is not only not an evangelism program, it actually is a discipleship regimen. But it's not just a discipleship regimen, it's also a worship regimen. Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. Guy comes to Jesus, and he says, what's the first and greatest commandment? I mean, really, what is it? Now, his motive was not pure. He wanted to entrap Jesus, right? He wanted to cause Jesus to become embarrassed, humiliated, whatever, by his answer. He wanted to create a situation, a scenario, a conversation where Jesus would be tripped up. And man, the Mosaic Law was full of commandments. What's the most important one? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That's the first and greatest commandment. Now, you notice the guy didn't ask for the top two. He didn't say, hey, Jesus, what are the top two commandments? He only asked for one. But Jesus always takes us a little further than maybe we are asking to go. And so he follows it up by saying this in verse 39. And the second, watch this, is like it. The second one is just as important as the first one. In fact, you can't separate the two. You got to love your neighbor as yourself. You see, being preoccupied with God requires that we not only allow him to have all of our attention, but that we're also all about his agenda. Let me show you something. I have an affinity for quadrants because they help me understand what an idiot I can be. And I want to measure just a couple of things. We talk about worship, and we're going to create a box here. That's not very dark, is it? Let's try this one. Is that better? Yeah, not really, right? Okay. It's one thing. The whiteboard isn't any good without a good pen. When we talk about giving God, part of worship is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That means God has our attention completely, right? The more we give God our attention, the better worshipers we become, right? That's the first and greatest commandment. Oh yeah, the second one's just like it. We talk about our attention and we talk about his agenda. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is people. This is giving God your attention, and pursuing His agenda. His agenda. Now, what do? We say, God, we have an agenda. This would be our agenda. And what we would like for you to do is to give your undivided attention to our agenda. Most people are not looking for God's will. Most people are looking for God to bless their will. That's not worship. It's kind of funny when you look at somebody who does not give God any attention and doesn't care about others. We could call this self-worship. Self-worship. It's all about you. Self-worship isn't a healthy place to live your life. You could probably talk about those who say they love God. I talk to especially younger leaders who are all about worshiping God and magnifying God and glorifying God. It's all about the experience with God. Okay, that's all right. But if all you're about is getting to know God and having this God experience, I call this self-deception. Because you think you're doing the right thing. When in reality, what God said is, if you're not about people, you're not about me. Whoever claims to love God but hates his brother is a what? It's a liar. See, that's where I get the self-deception. And then you talk to people who are all about people, but they don't do it for God. We live in a very social, engineered, reach out to mankind, do good works and good deeds, and just help other people. I mean, it's an important thing. But they're not doing it as part of their worship. They're doing it just as part of a human agenda. I call this self-destruction. You say, well, why would that be self-destruction? Because, as soon as I remember how to spell it, I'll explain it. What happens when you do things for others but not for God? What happens when you do things for men but not as unto the Lord? What happens when you as a husband are trying to love your wife but not loving her as unto the Lord, or wives loving their husbands as unto the Lord, or working for your employers as unto the Lord, or benefiting your employees as unto the Lord? Everything is unto the Lord. Why? Because people don't appreciate you. You'll run out of steam quickly. You'll want to give up. You'll want to throw in the towel. Can't blame you. All the hard work you put into just helping them out, and they won't even tithe. It's a good thing we don't do it for them. It's a good thing we do it as part of our worship to God. You don't want to self-destruct. You don't want to self-deceive. That's why you have to have balance. You know what Oikos is? It's a worship regimen. This is true worship. So when people say to me, you know, Tom, I just don't want to be a seeker church where it's all about bringing people to Christ. I don't either, actually. Look at, you got some circles, and this will take a few minutes, but this will be fun. You've got some circles. Let me get rid of the board now. Apologize for my board skills. I have tremors, so I shake. My hand shakes. And as a result, sometimes what used to be fairly easy to reach charts are a little less than that now, which is why I depend primarily on Keynote now. Okay, so we've got these three circles. The objective of the incarnation was to what? Was to save the lost. And likewise, the purpose of the Great Commission is to transcend every circle of relationships. Go into all the world. You know, the Great Commission is a great commission because it's all about changing every relational setting. throughout the world, which is how the church has grown for the last 2,000 years. Data. We're data-driven. That's the way it has happened. Transformational relationships, that's tactical. Save the lost, that's objective. Jesus Christ came. He was born. He lived a perfect life. He died. He conquered the grave. He ascended to the Father. And in so doing, he created this pathway to eternity. But before he left, he gave us this great purpose to engage. And that, of course, is for the individual Christian. But he did something else. Remember? He also engineered a strategy. How are we going to get from Jesus to your people? You know, go home to your own people. How are we going to get the message of the cross to your people? Well, he created a strategy. Build the local church. There's a process there. We could call it a locker room. We could call it a weight room. We could call it a team to be a part of. You want to change your world for Christ? You want to reach your Oikos? So do I. You want to reach your Oikos? Your 8 to 15? So do you want to reach your 8 to 15? So do I. You know what we ought to do? Actually, we ought to meet together. Why don't we meet together every Sunday morning on the Lord's Day and develop a support group for people who want to change the world? And then, let's call it a church. Because that's what church actually is. You see, without synergy between the incarnation, the structure and goals of a local church, and the personal mission of every believer, without synergy, we're just spinning our wheels. And this is the thing. This is what I've always maintained. That's why it isn't just taking the gospel that Jesus gave us and telling people, go out and witness to your friends. What are you guys doing? How are we filling the gap between our Savior and the objective? Believers have a challenge. Designate an audience. Display God's character. Defend our faith. That is what they are supposed to do. So what are we doing? 3 local churches. Let me just describe these 3 different churches. One is a congregation-centered church. A congregation-centered church is a church that exists for itself. Actually, they don't have any desire to reach lost people because they're satisfied with their Christian friends. Their life is good. Why rock the boat? They have an inward vision and they have an inward structure. They're not telling people, they're reading the right verses, but in their hearts, they're just comfortable with the church not growing. And it doesn't. And that's why they've structured that way. It's all for me. Everything is for believers. And then the Holy Spirit lands in some leadership conference, and all of a sudden the pastors or maybe key leaders in the church are under the conviction of the Spirit that they have to reach people. It can't just be about us. So we're going to become community-centered churches. We're going to have this outward vision. It's not just inward and upward. It's inward, upward, and outward. Only problem is it doesn't affect their structure. Now they have an outward vision, but they have an inward structure. The way the church operates on a regular basis, look at its budget. How are the monies designated? Look at its staffing. How are the positions designated? Look at its systems. How are the classes engineered? The discipleship regimen. What does that look like? We talk about being outward focused, but we don't want to change the inward structure. And by the way, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting, no matter what you say to the congregation. What church has never said, go out and share Christ with your non-believing friends? Did anybody in this room grow up in a church that did not tell you that? We all say that. And then oikocentric churches. Outward vision, and they facilitate that vision with an outward structure. Now, what does that mean in terms of some sequential, steps? Number 1, congregation-centered churches have conversations about the unchurched. They come together and they talk about the evil in the world, and just how bad it is out there. Thank God we're not out there. Thank God we're not like those poor slobs who don't have Jesus. Community-centered churches have conversations to the unchurched. From church, talking to them. Oikocentric churches have conversations with the unchurched because there's dialogue. It's not just about displaying God's character, it's all about discussing faith. And that is a two-way street. Congregation-centered churches have personal growth as their mission. That's all they want to do is grow personally. It's all about remaining in Him and allowing His Word to remain in us. That's all it's about. Community-centered churches, personal growth trumps personal mission. We do want people to share their faith with others, but really what it's about, because of the way we're structured, it's still all about our own personal growth. In Oikocentric churches, personal growth facilitates personal mission. The growth that we experience in our discipleship classes is actually fueling the conversations that we're having with our oikos. Congregation-centered churches, visitors are looking for a home church. And whenever I hear that, so why come to HC? We're looking for a home church, brother. Well, there's one right down the road. And maybe you need, I know the pastor personally, I'll set up an appointment for you. Community-centered churches, visitors are looking for a good church. But in oikocentric churches, visitors are looking for Jesus. And I will tell you, people are looking for Jesus. They don't know His name, but they're looking for Him. It's just amazing. Every time I open the papers, every time I turn on the TV news, which is very seldom, it's like the world is crying out for help. Would somebody please save us? Congregation-centered churches market to Christians. That's why it's all about, having a good old time when we come together. We'll go out and get special groups so we can all have a good time together, Just whatever it is. We'll get a special speaker. We'll get an evangelist. That's what we'll do. Why would we get an evangelist? Well, because that's where evangelism happens. Okay. Community-centered churches market to the community. Always calling to the community. Maybe it's a matter of inviting the community to come to a Christian concert. Think about that for a minute. Inviting the non-believers in the community to come to a Christian concert. Okay, think about that for a minute. Community-centered churches, by the way, are still congregation-centered churches in the way they are, just not in the way they talk. Oikocentric churches market to create conversations. And we're not perfect at that. Even this afternoon when we start talking about strategies and how we actually are structured, outwardly structured, you're going to say, well, you tell us what you do. I don't even know if I want to tell you what we do because we don't even do it that well. I'm hoping that somebody will come to one of these seminars and actually start doing it so right that I can go, oh man, I wish I would have thought of that. Man, we're going to start coming to your seminars. Wouldn't bother me at all. But when it comes to HTC, we don't advertise, bulk mailing. We don't do those things. Not that you shouldn't. Don't feel guilty if you do. You might want to kind of reevaluate that. But that's not oikocentric. In fact, I remember a few years ago, when is this session supposed to end? 11:15 or 11:30? Okay, I got a few minutes. A few years ago, a guy comes to me. He's from, just put it out there, he's from the Southern Baptist Church, and I love him very much. He's not there anymore. But a great guy, great leader. And he says, we have the resources now, we think, to marshal this ability, to bring together this ability to put the Jesus film, remember the Jesus film a few years ago? And it was great. I had no problem with the Jesus film. To mail that to every home in the high desert. But we're going to need the support of all of the churches, and HCC was the largest church in the high desert, so I knew what that meant. We're going to need X number of dollars. And I said, well, we don't want to do that. And it was just almost an affront. It was an offense. Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? I said, well, I'll tell you what I will do. Let me buy 5,000 copies of the film. We'll give them out to every family in our church, and they can invite somebody in their Oikos over for dinner and watch the video. Well, no, they want to do that. They want to do this direct mailing. We would never think of doing that in a million years. Not that some shouldn't. I don't know. I should ask him how that went. I don't even know how that whole thing went, because they did it anyway. We don't market, for example, we don't advertise in the newspaper. And people say, well, why don't you advertise in the newspaper? Because non-believers don't read the church section of the newspaper, generally. You know, I was reading in the church section of the newspaper about your church. Generally, that's not true. Yellow pages, phone book, not that anybody uses those anymore, same thing. We have spots on the radio. Why do we have spots on the radio? It isn't even a hard sell to come to church. It's usually a silly story, and I have kind of a sordid sense of humor, and so it's out there. People tell me all the time, I recognized your voice. Are you the guy on the radio? Yeah, I'm the guy on the radio. And you know what they never say? I want to come to your church. Because I don't even care. In our conversation, this is why we have the radio spots. Because when Scott invites, who attends our church, not that he does, but you live in San Diego, it's a commute, attends our church, and he invites, Josh. He invites his friend Josh, and Josh has heard the radio spot, had never any intention whatsoever to attend High Desert Church. But since he's now invited, Josh says to Scott, your pastor, have I heard him on the radio? Yeah, he speaks most of the time. You ought to come hear him speak. What are we marketing for? To create conversation. A few years ago, one of the best series I think we ever did was in Galatians, and it was Vote No on Religion. This was during Prop 8. Remember that? And Prop 8 was a hot, topic. And voting no on Prop 8 meant that you were in favor of the same-sex marriage agenda. So we put a huge billboard driving up and down the freeway, vote no on religion, highdesertchurch.com. We got little, and this is during the October, November, when everybody's just freaking out about Prop 8. We actually got those little lawn signs with the little, things where thousands of families from High Desert Church have vote no on religion on the front, and people would come over and they would say, are you guys against Prop 8? Say, well, no. Well, what is that? Well, we're studying the book of Galatians, and it's not about religion, but having a personal relationship with God. And people will still tell you at HTC, that created more conversations with the houses living right across the street and right next door to them than any other thing that had ever happened in their entire lives. How do we market? We just want to create a dialogue. Why? Because it's a simple process of evoking discussion with your oikos. Open up a dialogue. One of the things our friend Scott and Sam and I are friends, and I'm friends to all of you, some of you too, but we've known each other for a long time, and there's one of our guys down in San Diego, Glenn, just had a heart attack. Not that is relevant, but to what I'm going to say, it's relevant to Glenn, but anyway. You guys don't tell him I said this. But he had a whole thing in his church. You know what the whole emphasis of his church was last year? Go up to someone in your oikos and just say, how can I pray for you? And he said he did that. It's a fairly small church. But he said everybody just went with it. And they went out and they started asking the question, how can I pray for you? And the people, they've never had a spiritual conversation before. And the people started to cry. Well, it's my son, and he's having a hard, and they start to, it's okay, really, I just want to pray. And immediately these conversations about life and eternity began to gush out of these people because somebody cared enough to ask if they could just pray for him. Anyway, it's all about creating conversations. Community-centered churches insist on doctrinal homogeneity. We'll talk a lot about that this afternoon. Doctrinal homogeneity. We all have to believe the same thing about everything. Community-centered churches seek doctrinal homogeneity on most issues. Oikocentric churches recognize doctrinal diversity on most issues. And we'll kind of flesh that out later today. Congregation-centered churches. Everyone knows everyone at church. I remember when we even suggested going to 2 services. Well, everyone won't know everyone. Oh, you're a congregation-centric Christian. I didn't actually say that. But it was pretty nice to be able to, kind of classify people as to how much I had to listen to them in terms of taking advice in the future. Everybody knows everybody at church. Community-centered churches. Everybody knows someone at church. Oikocentric churches. Everybody knows their oikos. That's all I care about. And one of the cool reasons why it's important is because when somebody from an oikos comes, we have greeting teams, greeters, where people, hi, it's nice to have you here. That's a real big deal in churches, and it's a big deal for us. We got, I don't know how many people, George, how many people you think are on those teams? A couple hundred people are just greeting people every weekend. So I think that's great. But with an oikocentric church, most of those people, they're just, there to decorate the campus because they all wear these kind of weird Hawaiian shirts. Because when somebody in an oikocentric church shows up for the first time, they already have their own personal concierge there meeting them, if not driving onto the campus with them. Greeting teams change their strategy completely. Everyone knows their oikos. Congregation-centered churches use subtraction. You get that when you're driving home. That's kind of a joke, but it's so true. Blessed reduction. The smaller the better, as long as we're all together and we're all alike and we're all safe and we're all Christians and we're all not contaminated. Community-centered churches use addition. Oikocentric churches use what? Multiplication. Congregation-centered churches are afraid of growth. Community-centered churches want growth. Oikocentric churches have growth. Because for 2,000 years, that's how the church has grown. It's the big 95.